Hello, thanks for joining me again. This is our second video when we're just beginning to set up in a few principles that we'll be talking about in more detail as we go along. But we're just beginning to talk about a little bit about society. And this one I was going to call What Makes It All Work. So as I said, this is the second video. If you have not watched the first video yet, please take a few minutes and go find that video. It's called Fair Trade, what the meaning of fair trade in our society. And it starts off with a few discussions that are very basic, but we're going to be building on those principles. So just to review quickly, in the previous video, we talked a little bit about what is fair trade, what does it mean, and we talked about a very simple scenario of how it may have begun a very long time ago, just as a simple trade of goods or perhaps services based on the needs and exchanging something of value. And then we discussed a little bit about how that became a little bit more involved, a little more complicated, and it developed into a situation where if one person had control of something that others need, then they can actually exert leverage and demand a price to be paid. And this was the beginnings of how currency began, by requiring that there be something given in trade rather than just a fair trade, that there had to be a currency involved, which that in itself set the stage so that those who control the world, or would control the world, had a way to more or less, we'll say, coerce the population to participate with this whole idea that there must be a trade that involves money. The other factor that we talked about was this idea of what's in it for me. And I mention this as the heart of what I call the merchant attitude, which is what controls our world now. So the idea that there must be something in it for me before I'm going to agree to anything is a principle that is woven into the fabric of our society. And it's one of the factors that makes it all work. And that was something that's very important for us to start getting a sense of understanding, that this is what weaves into what keeps this system running in our society. So as we move forward, one might be thinking, why does this matter? You know, why should I care? Well, it's important for us to understand the principles that are involved, because this is, well, for the main answer to that particular question is, this is the way that they get you and everybody else in the world to cooperate with the system. So we need to understand what's really going on. And we're going to be talking about cause and effect. This has been on my mind a little bit the last few days, the idea of understanding the causes and the effects of things. Most of what we see around us in the world around us is the effect. It's the results. So the problems that we see in our society, those are the result of the situation, the result of what is causing this to be happening. The conditions of the world that I say a lot. But with any kind of problem, if we're going to try to find a way to solve a problem, we first have to understand the problem itself. And then we need to understand what is causing the problem. And we need to understand what those causes are if we're going to be able to take some kind of action that's effective in order to bring about change. This applies to anything that we want to bring change to, whether it's our personal issues, whether it's about healing the inner child, whether it's about creating new habits, or whether we want to address the conditions in our world that are unfair or unjust. So moving on, the principles that we're working with is a system, and it's based on the pursuit of money and self-interest. I've probably said that a lot already, but it's important that we understand that that's what it is that we're dealing with. It's a system of society that we've all been more or less programmed and conditioned to accept. We just accept it blindly, and that's part of the programming, is we just accept it. We don't question it. And that is built into the programming, and that you don't dare question what's going on around us. So this system of the pursuit of money and self-interest, so it evolved from that fair trade idea that we talked about earlier. And then we have the demand for money that comes into play. So as a process of that, okay, let's consider the example that I was giving in the last video. That suppose I'm a merchant, or in these days a corporation, a corporate merchant, which we will, for our terms of our discussions, will apply to any situation where there is something that is needed for the people to be able to live, but there's a price being required. So I talked about, well, if I've got control of the money, and if you want to eat, then I've got leverage on you, right? I've got a way to I have an advantage over you because you need to eat and you don't have the money. I mean, you don't have the bread. I've got the bread, or I've got the food. And we took that a little bit further and said, well, what happens if I were to get control of all of the food? What then? Well, it puts you in a position where you basically have to do anything or become willing to do whatever it takes to get whatever it is that I demand. So as this grew and developed to a group of those people who wanted to be in control of the world, so they eventually manipulated their way to get control of all of the resources that we need to live and put a price on those things. Now, why would they do that? Well, we were just discussing that, because it gives them a leverage over you. Because if they control the things that you need, it puts you in that position where you basically have to do whatever they say, because it becomes a matter of survival. You come to terms with that, or maybe you don't realize it, but you are aware in some manner that you have to do whatever it takes in order to survive. Now let's move on to the other point of the what's in it for me. So there may be a tendency to dismiss this as, oh no, that's not me. And it may not be, but it is the case for the majority of the world. The point is, why would they want to encourage this? Well, for one thing, it's that merchant attitude. And another reason this is very important is because it sets up the cooperation of the people, the population. So if all the people in the world are in a position of that they need the things that are needed to live, and the merchants are in control of those things and requiring the money, then it puts you in a position to do whatever it takes. I've said that already. But what they want for you to cooperate with the system. So let's look at this a little bit. So let's suppose I'm a merchant and my goal is to acquire massive amounts of wealth and property and things of the world. Now let's suppose I'm living in that huge mansion that's up on the hill. I've got a couple of yachts. I've got a dozen cars sitting in the driveway. And in terms of, say, current world, say I'm a CEO and I'm making, let's say, $80 million a year. Now, if you're a person who doesn't have all those worldly luxuries, you might not like that too much. You might look at me and say, well, how come you get to have all of this stuff and I don't? In fact, population overall might do that. It's not going to be considered acceptable by the public, right? In other words, you're going to object to me living in this excess while you may be kind of struggling to survive. And we've seen this through history, and that the nobility would abuse this whole thing of living in excess and wealth to the point that there have been times in history when the people rebelled and said, this is not okay, we're not putting up with this anymore. And there were rebellions. If you're familiar with history, you may recall there was such a thing that happened in France, and Russia also had a similar revolution where in both of these cases the nobility, most of the nobility, were executed because of their abuse of their wealth and power. So they kind of learned from this. So the ideal then is for you to cooperate with their system of being able to live in their excess. So how do they do that? Well, they convince you to go along with it. So if I'm a merchant and I go, or let's say a CEO of a corporation, and I go, well, you can have this kind of life too. You can have the nice big house, you can have the big salary, you can have the nice fancy new cars, you can have the diamond rings, you can have all of the wonderful stuff that money makes possible in the world. You can have that too, if you just choose to pursue it. And it's for your own interest. You can have a better quality life. You can have a better quality life for you and your family. And you can pursue all of your dreams and desires in whatever way that you want to. There you go. So what are you going to do? Okay. You see, now it has become acceptable at that point, because when you accept the idea of pursuing after your own version of the life of your dreams and desires, then you've made it acceptable, and you've made it what me, as the merchant living in excess, you've made it okay for me to be doing what I'm doing. It's now acceptable in the public eye. And if the whole population is accepting this, then now it's acceptable in society. So a lot of what is presented in the world, or encouraged in the world, is to pursue after anything and everything. Materialism, pursue after glamour, pursue after the big house, the fancy car. This is also why a lot of our society has been encouraged to sort of worship or idolize the rich and the famous, and like the performers and the athletes and their excessive salaries. And occasionally someone will go, well, that football star is making $3 million a year. Wow, I mean, how does he get away with that? Or it might even be more. I'm not sure what the rates are nowadays. I don't keep up with it, but it might be 30 million now. But the CEOs, for example, that's not unusual. 30 million, maybe 30 million a year. But we're not supposed to object to that, because everyone's pursuing the same thing. That makes it okay. So the conditions of imbalance and injustice, inequity, these are all just side products. And it's considered to be, these are acceptable conditions in society because people want to pursue this for themselves. So we're just not going to really do anything about, the problems it's causing. So having this discussion, which is going longer than I had intended to. I'm only about halfway through what I was going to discuss. So I would like to begin the discussion to invite you to start taking a look at this aspect of how our society is arranged. And part of the discussion that I'm going to be suggesting that we be having with other people is, how does this apply to you in your own life? And where have you accepted the idea at some point, probably at a much earlier age? Probably most of us were taught these things as children. In fact, this is how a lot of this works, is that society is arranged, or it influences everybody's lives in a way that as children we are exposed to these ideals of how life is, how the world is, how the world works. And as a child, we accept that this is just the way life is, and this is the way the world works. And we're told all these things from the time we're born, and we hear these things in the environment that we're living in. I call this the programming of childhood, to accept the society, accept the system of society. So, I mean, we hear these things from the start. Let's just mention a few of them. Money makes the world go round. We've heard that one. It's a dog-eat-dog world, which makes it mean that it's acceptable, basically kind of in a metaphoric way, to attack another person and maybe take what they've got. Every man for himself, right? So that means that I'm the only one I care about. Everybody else can, I don't care what happens to them. But in the conditions of society, what that usually means is that we're out to take advantage of that other person, because this is the way the system works, is that in order to succeed, in order to get those things of the world, we usually have to do something that it may involve taking it away from another person. And in the metaphoric language that we're going to be talking about, we'll call this doing battle on the field of competition, in whatever form that takes. In modern society, that's corporate America. Well, corporate America where we are, it's corporate America. But in the corporate world, we'll call it, to where one corporate arrangement is basically doing battle with other people, other companies, competition. That's what competition is about. Here's one. Who has the gold makes the rules. So this sets the standard that whoever has got the most money, they rule the world, or basically. So we've got those few who have the most money, and they are the ones who are ruling the world. We'll get into more detail of that at another time. Here's another one. Look out for number one. That means I'm in it for me. Whatever it is that I'm after, my desires, my intent, my self-interest, that's all that matters. Now, you and I may not relate to this too much, because we've got a little different view of the world. But for many of the people out there, that's what it is. Because they are taught that this is the way they must think and act and behave in order to succeed in the world. And these are things that they learn as children. Oh, here's another one. Only the strong survive, or the survival of the fittest. So this is kind of comparing us to the animal world, which is another way of making this behavior okay. In that it's comparing to, well, in nature, the strongest animals are the ones that survive and the weak ones don't make it. So that means it's okay, and that we're going to act the same way. Here's another one. Got to take what you want. So there are attitudes that are out there that are like, well, to get what you want, you just got to go out and take it. But there are other attitudes of things that are like, you can have what you want, but you got to work really, really hard. That's a whole other discussion about the attitudes that become the belief systems that people acquire during childhood. But there is an element of this, that this conformity to the system is being formed in early childhood, basically from the start. And it's about the environment within the family environment and the attitudes and perceptions that the parents have, which they acquired from their parents when they were children, who also, so we're talking about a multi-generational thing. So some of us that have been around and have dealt with some of the psychological type things like the inner child and or inner child healing and various other types of, we might call them wounds, may be familiar with this idea of it being a multi-generational effect, that we'll call it dysfunctional aspects of our personality comes from our childhood, which comes from the conditions that our parents created that we live in, but they are carrying their childhood wounds from their own childhood, from the effects of that they were living in, and that comes from their parents, which is now grandparent level. Anyway, the point is that this goes back multiple generations. So it's not only emotional or psychological wounding that is being passed down from generation to generation. It is also the conditions which keeps our society working, that keeps us entrenched in or obedient to or conform to the system of society. And these two main principles, which is that in order to survive in the world, we need to be in the pursuit of the money, because that's what makes living possible. It's what makes it possible to survive. And it's about pursuing our own self-interest, because that becomes a survival thing too. And that's what justifies whatever behavior that comes up by maybe not you and I, but maybe by people that are out there in the world, that the things that they learned or observed or the conclusions that they come to as a child during those first few years, that this is the way the world works, and whatever we accept as what's true becomes the reality that we live. We're going to get into that a lot more detail later, because this becomes one of the keys to what makes it work and what we're going to do about it. So yeah, I'm running longer than I intended to, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. I didn't get through everything that I wanted to talk about, but we'll pick up some of these other ideas maybe a little bit later. But please watch these videos, and please look at the posts that I'm putting up in the group, because we are developing a discussion that's going to have layers. It's a many layered type situation. The society that we're in is very complicated, and we'll get into a little bit of the nature of how complex and complicated that the system is a little bit later. But it can be a little overwhelming, so I don't want to dive into that just yet. So let's just start trying to get a handle on these ideas, because this is part of what we're going to be wanting to work with. And that what I am suggesting that is that as we gain an understanding of these principles, that we then take these discussions, these conversations that we're having out into the world, and have them with other people. It's like one person conveying a message to another person. And as that person begins to understand the principles of, we'll say, what's wrong in the world, and make a decision that we don't want to live like this, that decision, which reaches deep down into their inner self, to let go of those ideas, perceptions, belief systems that keep this system running the way that it is now. That process of making a choice to change what it is that we agree to as a society, that gives us the key to be able to bring about change in the world. So I hope you found it worthwhile to take a few minutes and to listen to this discussion. I realize that on one hand, some of these ideas still seem fairly simplistic, and I realize that on another hand, they probably seem kind of like, well, what does this have to do with anything? And why should I care? But I assure you, these are fundamental principles we're starting to talk about. At some point, you will realize that these are principles that we're generally not aware of, and things that we need to understand about our society and what makes it work the way it does, as a place to start in order to make a difference. So thanks for spending a few minutes with me, and we will be continuing to have these discussions. I hope you will hang in there with me until we get to a point where it starts getting interesting. Thanks. Bye.